Blood and power consumed Henry VIII in his final days. His massive, rotting body lay dying in the winter of 1547. Once a golden prince of Europe, he'd become a monstrous tyrant gasping for breath in Whitehall Palace. Courtiers whispered, "The lion is dying." But even now his claws remained sharp. His body was a battlefield of horrific afflictions. Massive ulcers oozed and stank so badly that people could barely stand near him. He needed mechanical devices just to move his enormous 400-pound frame. His once handsome face was now bloated and yellow, eyes sunken deep into sick flesh. Doctors had tried everything: bloodletting, herbal potions, prayers. Nothing worked. Modern historians believe he suffered from diabetes, gout, and a brutal bone infection that caused constant agony. His mind was crumbling too. Explosive rage would suddenly erupt, then fade into confused silence. Even dying, Henry was political. His son Edward, just 9 and frail, was the heir. Powerful factions were already plotting to control the boy: Catholic nobles, Protestant reformers. Henry watched them all, signing death warrants with trembling hands. The mighty king was falling, but he would not go quietly. The king's health was a secret nobody dared speak about. Official announcements painted him as strong, but the reality was far grimmer. Inside his royal chambers, a horrifying scene unfolded. His massive bed draped in dark fabrics, the stench of decay hanging heavy in the air. He was a shell of the powerful monarch he'd once been. Screams echoed through Whitehall's stone walls. His leg ulcers tortured him. Even the slightest movement sent waves of unbearable pain through his body. Doctors tried everything: bizarre treatments with boiled onions and even powdered human skull. Opium became his only real relief. It dulled the pain but scrambled his already fragmented mind. The most feared man in England was now completely helpless. He raved about ghosts, called out for dead wives. Moments of clarity were spent obsessing over his will, desperate to control his legacy even after death. Religion consumed his final days. One moment Catholic, the next Protestant. His nightmares were filled with the faces of those he'd executed: Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, all staring in silent accusation. The court was a snake pit of ambition. Everyone knew the king was dying. Everyone wanted power. Factions formed. Alliances shifted. The future of England hung in a delicate, dangerous balance. Henry's final days were a brutal spectacle of decay. Norfolk, once sentenced to death, narrowly escaped execution when Henry died first. On January 27, 1547, the king's collapse began in terrifying fashion. Witnesses described his seizure so violent that attendants had to physically restrain him. When it passed, Henry was a broken man, partially paralyzed, unable to speak clearly. A massive stroke had destroyed the once powerful monarch. Court physicians worked in a panic. They knew failure meant their own death. Hot irons seared his skin. Bitter medicines were forced down his throat. Every moment was a desperate battle for survival. Thomas Cranmer controlled access to the royal chamber. Secrecy was crucial. The king's condition could spark invasions or power struggles. Only trusted servants were allowed near him. Even his wife Catherine was kept at a distance. Henry drifted between consciousness and darkness. In rare moments of clarity, terror consumed him. The man who had executed wives and nobles now trembled before the prospect of divine judgment. He mumbled prayers, begged forgiveness, a far cry from the ruthless king who had reshaped England. Servants worked in shifts, managing the gruesome task of caring for his failing body. Massive ulcers covered his legs. Bone showed through rotting flesh. The stench was unbearable. Perfumed handkerchiefs were a necessity for anyone brave enough to enter his chamber. In the royal chamber, windows were thrown open despite the bitter winter, as the king slipped in and out of consciousness. By late February, even the court could no longer pretend Henry might recover. Archbishop Cranmer rushed to the king's bedside. Henry's breathing was ragged. Weak and unable to speak, he was asked to signal his faith by squeezing Cranmer's hand. With his last bit of strength, Henry reportedly squeezed, a moment Protestant historians would later celebrate as a dramatic deathbed conversion. He died before dawn on January 28, 1547. His massive body dominated the room even in death, a grotesque testament to years of excess and suffering. Officially, they called it natural decay, but doctors today would point to a deadly mix of heart failure, infected wounds, and likely diabetes. More fascinating than his death was what happened next. The Privy Council kept silent for 3 full days. They worked quickly. While Henry's body cooled, Edward Seymour, the new king's uncle, moved with cold precision. Secret meetings, fortresses secured, rivals neutralized. When London's bells finally rang, Seymour was already Lord Protector. Henry's body told its own grim story, decomposing so fast that even professional embalmers were shocked by his diseased organs, especially his ruined liver. Henry's massive body was so huge that his coffin needed special construction. It was nearly twice the size of a normal noble's casket. The weight was so immense that extra bearers had to help transport it. Things got even more gruesome. The lead-lined coffin actually split open, leaking bodily fluids onto the chapel floor. Dogs reportedly licked at the disgusting seepage, a final, humiliating moment for a king who once demanded absolute respect. The funeral procession was a last display of royal power. Black-draped horses pulled the enormous coffin through streets packed with mourners. Effigies showed Henry as he was in his prime, strong and commanding, not the bloated, sick man he'd become. At Windsor Castle, he was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son and the only one spared his notorious temper by dying in childbirth. The reality of his rotting corpse was nothing like the powerful image court painters had created. Hans Holbein's portraits showed a muscular, defiant king, a far cry from the diseased body now buried beneath stone. His 30-page will revealed his final attempt to control everything. He specified the succession: first Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. This plan would ultimately be followed, with each of his children ruling as Tudor monarchs before the dynasty ended with Elizabeth's death. Henry set up a council of 16 men to rule until his son Edward turned 18. Smart move, right? But power plays happened fast. Edward Seymour quickly outmaneuvered everyone and became Lord Protector just days after Henry died. It showed how quickly a king's careful plans could fall apart. Henry's final days were a medical mystery. Doctors tried everything, and I mean everything. They sliced live pigeons in half and slapped them on his wounds. They mixed gold and precious stones into weird experimental treatments. Nothing worked. His medical records read like a horror show. Historians think he probably had type 2 diabetes and a nasty bone infection. But what's really fascinating, the personal stuff they found after he died. In a small locked chest, they discovered intimate treasures: a tiny portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair from his mother, a child's prayer book. These weren't just royal artifacts. They were glimpses of a human being behind the monster. When Henry died, everything changed. The Catholic forces got pushed aside. Protestant reforms kicked into high gear. Archbishop Cranmer, who had just given Henry his last rites, started pushing through religious changes Henry had always been cautious about. A new era was beginning. Years after Henry's death, England drifted further into Protestant territory, far beyond what the king himself had planned. His religious stance was complicated. He'd broken away from Rome but still clung to many Catholic traditions, creating a murky legacy that both Protestants and Catholics could claim. Protestant reformers loved highlighting his rejection of papal power. Catholics, meanwhile, pointed to his defense of key religious practices. This theological confusion would spark religious battles throughout the reigns of his 3 children. England swung wildly. First, radical Protestantism under Edward, then Catholic restoration under Mary. Finally, Elizabeth established a middle ground. Henry's death was more than just a royal transition. It shook the entire country. Royal storytellers had spent years painting Henry as England's heroic defender against foreign threats. Now they faced the challenge of transferring that powerful image to a 9-year-old boy. Young Edward's portraits deliberately mimicked his father's. Same wide stance, same defiant look. Court ceremonies emphasized total continuity. Courtiers still bowed to Edward's empty throne with the same deep respect they'd shown Henry. Beyond politics, Henry's death created a massive psychological hole. For decades, his personality had shaped everything: local governance, national policy. Everything. His passing left people feeling lost and uncertain. Parish records from early 1547 show widespread anxiety. People reported strange dreams, weird celestial signs. Some even claimed to see ghosts. For a population steeped in religious symbolism, the death of such a powerful king felt almost apocalyptic. Internationally, reactions were complex. The French ambassador genuinely mourned. The emperor wondered about potential vulnerabilities with a child king. Everything was uncertain. Pope Paul III, who had once kicked Henry out of the church, surprisingly offered a mass for his soul. It was a clever move, honoring the king while still claiming spiritual high ground. The rooms where Henry died became instantly legendary. Whispers spread through the palace. Courtiers were spooked, talking about strange sounds and cold spots where the king had breathed his last. Young Edward, just 6 years old, refused to sleep in his father's bed. He demanded new chambers, haunted by the memory of Henry's brutal decline. Henry's death hit everyone hard. Those who had spent years serving his every unpredictable whim were deeply shaken. His medical records became a fascinating window into Tudor healthcare. Doctors documented everything, desperate to prove they'd tried everything to save the king. They used a wild mix of ancient and emerging medical techniques: hot cupping, herbal remedies, early forms of water therapy. None of it worked. But the records survived, a testament to their desperate attempts. Even in death, Henry was obsessed with his image. He planned an enormous tomb, 40 bronze statues, a towering central monument with a massive equestrian statue of himself on top. Pure ego, pure anxiety about how history would remember him. Ironically, the whole grand plan fell apart. Financial troubles meant the bronze was melted down during the Civil War, a fate that would have driven Henry mad. In the days after his death, the court scrambled. Some emerged from hiding, others tried to distance themselves. Just another dramatic chapter in Henry's legendary life. His loyal staff scrambled to find new protection after his death. The royal archives hold heartbreaking letters from servants who suddenly lost their positions after decades of service. For many, adapting was impossible. The skills needed to manage Henry's wild moods meant nothing in Edward's calmer court. Some former favorites were so lost, they took their own lives in the months after the king died. They couldn't handle the lightning-fast power shifts. Henry's death was a massive turning point. It marked the end of absolute monarchy and the start of a more collaborative system of governance. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, didn't have Henry's terrifying personal power. He had to rely on council approval. This shift would eventually shape England's unique political system. Ironically, Henry's death weakened the very monarchy he'd spent his life building up. Doctors across generations tried to understand his final illness. Victorian physicians saw his condition as punishment for sexual sins. Early 20th century experts blamed metabolic issues like gout and diabetes. Modern historians suggest more complex diagnoses, including rare genetic conditions and brain damage from his youthful jousting. Even Henry's personal items became sacred. Court records show how objects he touched in his final days were treated with deep reverence. Some were preserved like holy relics, despite Protestant beliefs. His final stained nightclothes were ceremonially burned under Cranmer's watch. Henry's final days were a complex dance of practicality and symbolism. His most precious items, astronomical instruments, maps, were carefully sorted and distributed. Some went to his young son Edward, others scattered according to his will. The royal family was left in a delicate position. Catherine Parr, his widow, mourned publicly but quickly married her true love, Thomas Seymour, a strategic move she'd long held back. 9-year-old Edward became king, but barely. His Seymour uncles pulled the strings. His journal entry about his father's death was chillingly detached, just a formal note, "My father whose soul got pardon." Mary and Elizabeth faced treacherous paths. Mary, a staunch Catholic, watched her brother's Protestant reforms with growing unease. Elizabeth, just 13, walked a razor's edge, her mother's execution and uncertain legitimacy making her position fragile. Henry's final hours were deeply lonely. Surrounded by physicians and courtiers, he was fundamentally alone. Even Archbishop Cranmer could barely reach him, getting only a final weak hand squeeze. The king who once commanded absolute obedience now confronted death in total isolation. A stark reminder that power means nothing in the face of mortality. After his death, the administrative chaos revealed just how completely Henry had controlled everything. Decisions sat unresolved, waiting for a king who would never return. Henry's final days were a complex dance of power and transition. The government had to reshape itself, moving away from the king's constant oversight. This wasn't easy at first, but it made the system stronger. His funeral was a massive spectacle. Imagine black-draped horses, ceremonial weapons, and a wax figure of the king riding through London. It was theater, pure royal drama. The procession was carefully planned. Every detail mattered. It wasn't just a funeral, it was a message. The monarchy would continue, no matter what. Doctors who treated Henry were in a tough spot. Some quickly found new positions with noble families. Others faced professional ruin. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had the guts to tell Henry about his impending death, managed to secure a place in the new king's court. Apothecaries were under intense scrutiny. Every medicine, every treatment was examined. Had they failed? Worse, had they deliberately hastened the king's death? Later, when workers renovated Henry's vault, they found something shocking. His skeleton was massive. Forensic studies suggest he weighed around 400 pounds, with a waist over 50 inches. His body was breaking down, joints deteriorating under the immense weight. It was an inglorious end for a once powerful king. Henry's wounds were a breeding ground for infection, likely hastening his death. What's most striking about his final days is how they exposed the limits of power. This king, who had transformed England, executed queens, and built a navy that would dominate the seas, was now completely powerless against his own failing body. Court records paint a picture of Henry lashing out at his doctors, demanding they heal him through sheer royal will. It was a futile fight against the harsh reality of human mortality. Even the most powerful monarch is just flesh and blood. The religious debates around his death created competing stories. Protestants claimed moments of spiritual clarity. Catholics painted him as a man haunted by his break from Rome. But the truth was more nuanced. Henry stayed true to his complex religious stance, essentially Catholic in practice, but rejecting the Pope's authority. His death triggered a massive financial crisis. The new government inherited an empty treasury, decimated by Henry's lavish spending and costly wars. He'd spent the equivalent of $200 million on palaces alone. This financial chaos forced Edward Seymour to continue selling church lands, triggering one of the biggest property transfers in English history. For many, Henry's physical decline was a metaphor for the nation itself. His body symbolized the kingdom, once powerful, now fragile and uncertain. Henry's rotting body became a symbol of deeper problems in the kingdom. Preachers in 1547 talked about how his infected legs represented the moral decay of English society. This wasn't just talk, it had real political meaning. During Edward's time, reformers argued that just like Henry's body needed radical treatment, so did England's religious practices. His final days were a weird moment where old and new ideas of kingship crashed together. The death rituals showed ancient traditions, worried about burial and who would rule next. But the medical records and precise legal documents also showed something more modern about how government worked. Henry died caught between two worlds. He was the last king with medieval power, but also the first to build a bureaucratic state that would shape future governments. His death was fascinating because it wasn't just about a king, it was about being human. After ruling through pure force of personality, Henry faced his end just like anyone else. He confronted his own limits. Accounts suggest he was terrified, facing judgment not as a powerful monarch, but as a simple man. The Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly told him, "You're about to go somewhere titles don't matter." In those vulnerable final moments, Henry finally connected with ordinary people in a way he never had before.